Shabbat Shalom. On June 7th, 1981, just hours before the festival of Shavuot was to begin, Prime Minister Menachem Begin summoned his cabinet to an emergency meeting. He looked drawn, grave, tired, and the reason soon became clear. Begin had just authorized one of the most daring operations in the history of Israel, Operation Opera. The Israeli Air Force had taken off on a mission to destroy Iraq's nearly completed Osirak nuclear reactor. The pilots would fly over 600 miles of hostile airspace. Failure would literally mean disaster. But for Begin, inaction was never an option. He was tormented by the weight of his responsibility as prime minister for millions of Israeli children, for the safety, for the security of the Jewish people. For months, he carried that burden alone, wrestling with the implications of action and inaction alike. Later, he would describe those sleepless nights. What would become of our children if I did nothing? What would become of our pilots if I did something? In the end, the choice crystallized, and it reflected really the core of Begin's worldview. He said, when I have to choose between saving the lives of our children or getting the approval of the Security Council and all those other fair weather friends, I much prefer the former. So he gave the order. The planes flew, and within 2 minutes, the reactor was reduced to rubble. Every Israeli pilot returned home safely. Begin had sent a message to the world and to Jewish history. Never again means never again. Israel would not wait for permission to protect its people. We would not outsource our fate to others. We would act. And if the world condemned us, the very world, by the way, which was just saved from a nuclear-armed tyrant, then so be it. That decision, so controversial then, and you can read about some of the world reaction to that decision, so prophetic now, embodied what Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik called the shift from fate to destiny. In his classic critical essay, Kol Dodi Dofek, Rabbi Soloveitchik draws a sharp distinction. Fate is what happens to us, the history that we inherit, the suffering that we endure. Destiny is how we respond, when we rise, when we act, when we shape the future with our own hands. From a historical object, he wrote, the Jew had become a subject, a creative partner in the historical drama. Rabbi Soloveitchik frames his theology around a verse from the Song of Songs, from the book of Shir HaShirim. Kol Dodi Dofek, the verse says, the voice of my beloved is knocking. And he lists then 6 knocks that have been heard since the establishment of the State of Israel, the founding of the state, the military victories, a theological awakening among the nations, the spiritual awakening of Jewish youth, the recognition that Jewish life has value, and the opening of the gates of return for the people of Israel. Each, he said, is a knock that people hear. It's God calling us back into the covenant. Now, Menachem Begin heard that knock, and he answered, because he knew what it meant to be the object of history, crushed by forces beyond one's control. The ghosts of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, never stopped haunting Begin, nor did the scars of his own odyssey through the darkest chapters of Jewish suffering. Born in Poland Begin watched his world collapse. His father, Zev Dov Begin, was drowned in a river by Nazis, singing as he drowned, Ani Ma'amin, I believe in the coming of the Messiah, singing Hatikva. His mother and brother were murdered soon after. Begin himself was arrested by the Soviet secret police. He was imprisoned, he was interrogated, and he was left in solitary confinement, but he never broke. When finally freed, he made his way to Palestine, living underground, on the move, in disguise, leading the Irgun armed resistance against the British. Now, to some, Begin was a terrorist. To others, he was a messianic spirit. But to all, Begin was a man who knew what it meant to be hunted, to be voiceless, responsible to a people whose survival could not be left to chance. So when faced with the threat of a nuclear Iraq, Begin didn't wait. He didn't ask permission. He acted. He chose destiny over fate, not because it was easy, but because he knew the cost of passivity. He vowed that the Jewish people would never again be helpless while danger gathered at the door. This weekend, this Sunday night, we will celebrate Shavuot, the festival of Torah, the festival of Sinai, the festival of Revelation. And Revelation, our tradition teaches, is not a one-time event. It's not something that gets frozen on a mountaintop. It's any moment that we've heard this morning where we make ourselves ready to hear the voice of God. Last week, we ended the book of Leviticus with the verse, "These are the commandments that the Lord gave Moses at Mount Sinai." This week, the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, a book of Numbers, we begin with, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting." Revelation continues. And what changed? The mountain is gone, but that sacred conversation that began on Sinai continues. Because Sinai isn't a place, it is a posture. It is a readiness to hear the knock and the courage to answer. And in the spirit of Shavuot, when we will read the book of Ruth, I want to add one more knock. It's not thunderous. It's tender. It's not national in scope, but deeply, deeply personal. Ruth, the central character in the book, stands at a crossroads. Her father has died, her husband has died. Naomi, her mother-in-law, urges her to return to the land of Moab, where she comes from, to start over. And she has every reason to go. Moab is her land. Moab is her people. Moab is her past. It's her story. But something stirs within Ruth. We don't know exactly what. Maybe it's Naomi's faith. Maybe it's a glimpse of purpose in the Jewish story. But Ruth chooses. She walks away from safety and into the unknown. And she speaks the words that bind her forever to our people. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Ruth chooses destiny. She opens the door, and because she does, she becomes the great-grandmother of King David, for whom the messianic future will one day unfold. Today we find ourselves curiously, painfully, in a moment that echoes that Shavuot Eve 44 years ago. The Jewish state is at war. The hostages are still not home. Israeli society feels like it is fraying. And we are left to ask, should this war continue? Should Israel act alone to strike Iran's nuclear facilities? Now, I don't know the answers. I have opinions. I have emotions. I have grief. But I don't have answers. What I do know is this. A people in control of its destiny does not outsource these decisions to the United Nations, to the international community, or the editorial pages of the New York Times. We do not survive by letting others determine our future. We must listen instead to the voices that speak from within. Voices like Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein. He's the Rosh Yeshiva. He's one of the heads of Yeshivat Har Etzion in Alon Shvut, and also, coincidentally, happens to be the grandson of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Recently, he said what few have dared, that this war may have run its course, that its moral clarity is now clouded by suffering, that our highest obligation may no longer be to fight, but to bring the hostages home and begin the long work of national healing. Now, Rabbi Lichtenstein is no pacifist, but he believes the time for war might be over, not because others demand it, but because we must demand it of ourselves. Then there is Dr. Tal Becker, senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, a frequent guest of our community both here and in Israel. In a recent conversation with Yehuda Kurtzer on his podcast, which I commend to you, he offered a nuanced framework of how to approach the ongoing war. If the goal is to dismantle Hamas, to create a post-Hamas reality, open the door to Palestinian self-governance, then in his opinion, the war remains just. Protecting Israeli lives, ensuring aid reaches civilians and not terrorists. These are, he said, moral imperatives. But even in a just war, especially in a just war, moral clarity must remain central. The suffering of Palestinian civilians, he says, cannot be ignored. For the Jewish people, moral responsibility is not a luxury, it's actually a sacred obligation. Now, whether or not we agree with Rabbi Lichtenstein or Tal Becker, the power of their voice lies not only in what they say, but where they speak from love of Israel, from moral seriousness, and from a loyalty to our covenant. These are the voices that I turn to, not the foreign diplomats, not the distant pundits, but to those who live in Israel, who defend the land, and who carry its burdens. These are the stewards of our destiny. To be a Jew, to stand at Sinai, to celebrate Shavuot, is ultimately to choose agency over apathy, to choose covenant over comfort, and to choose our destiny over fate. So this Shavuot, may we, like Ruth, like Menachem Begin, step forward, not into fear, but to faith, not as victims of history, but as its authors, because the voice of our beloved is still knocking, and the future of our people depends on how and if we answer that door. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you for joining the Park Avenue Synagogue family. I hope you enjoyed the sermon. Please consider supporting our online community by scanning the QR code or by going to supportpas.org or by making a donation. Shalom and see you in Shul.